Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today. If you wanted to go and study religion formally, academically, get a PhD in religion, just how would you do that? I think it might come as a surprise to people who've not studied religion formally or academically that you actually have more choices to make other than choosing to study religion, or even studying for ministry, or even studying Christianity. It's the case with academic study of religion, just like almost every other field or discipline, that over time academic studies have become more and more specific. And there's a reason I think that matters, because for the person in the pew, we receive a lot of religious training, specifically Christian ministry, from one person who we expect, and by that I mean the pastor. We expect pastors to generally be jacks or jills of all trades. That there's a sense that we are supposed to know a little bit about the Bible, a little bit about Christian history, a little bit about world religions, a little bit about ministry particularities, a little bit about Greek and Hebrew. And all of these things need to be pumped into the professionals who are pastors and religious educators. Nonetheless, it's the case that when I chose to study for religion, I was a religious studies undergrad, and then I got my MDiv for ministry, and then I went on to do more studies specific to theology and ethics. It was the case that I was choosing to do less Bible, or less church or Christian history or religious history. And those decisions come more or less constantly. Every time I would enroll for a semester's classes, I had those sorts of choices to make. Every professional religious worker has to. But when we know things like Martin Luther wrote his own hymns so he could carry a tune, he was poetic in the sense that you need to be a little poetic to write a hymn. He also translated the Bible. He also dealt with the matters of the church in practical sorts of ways. Isn't that the sort of minister we want? Don't we want people like Luther and Calvin who were jacks and jills of all trades? Well, it's awfully hard to get the kind of scholarship that would allow for that now. How does that matter? Why does that matter? And how does that impact you as you seek to understand religion or Christianity or faith while you're in the pew? Those are the things I've been musing about. What does it mean to have specific sorts of studies, and what does it mean in seminaries and in universities, colleges of arts and science, that the disciplines of ministry are divided and specific? If you're interested in hearing what those are or why that might matter, I hope you might stick around. Generally, there are 4 paths that one can choose if you are doing formal religious education. Within the Christian tradition specifically, there are some you might imagine. Church history. You learn about the origins of the church. You learn about the schisms and the divisions in the church, where different denominations came from, some of the things that caused those denominations, who fought whom, who was martyred, who was sacrificed, and how do we have the church in the forms that it exists now. Church history. Bible. You have to do a lot of ancient reading. You have to learn to read Greek and Hebrew, maybe Aramaic, and you spend a lot of time in the library with the Bible open and a whole bunch of other language resources, studying how the words came together, how the words became letters, how those letters were composed. Maybe they came from different sources, and who debates whom about which was actually Paul, and is this bit of Isaiah from the 8th century, or was it pre-Assyrian or post-Babylonian, or when was it written and why would that matter? You know, Bible study. Church history, Bible study, theology. I was a theology student. We are the ones most likely to make up whatever we want to. We are trying to speak based on the themes that we read in Scripture and in church tradition and in church history, while doing that onward work. So biblical work specifically looks back to ancient texts. Theology can do that. There's historical theology where you're trying to better understand what Karl Barth said, what Tertullian said, what the debates in the medieval Catholic Church were. But the more fun part is constructive, contemporary theology. As we experience the world as we have it today, this is a little dated now, but what does the Bible and Scripture say to us, realizing that they had no idea about nuclear weapons, American chattel slavery, whatever the case may be today that is different than it was? How do we sense that the Spirit is still at work, God is still speaking, and how do we understand who God is based on our own experiences and circumstances? Contemporary theology. That's what I did. Church history, Bible, theology, and here's the one that you're going to think sounds the best: practical theology. Practical theology is also sometimes called ministry. What sorts of classes do you take in a practical theology class? That splinters off some more, but it might mean counseling courses, like how to do premarital counseling. It might mean something like church administration and how to do some basic accounting. I did not ever take basic accounting classes. Fortunately, we have other people here that do that. So those four disciplines, practical theology, theology specific or academically, philosophically, Bible and church history, are generally the four divisions that ministry takes. And so whoever a minister might be, so if we were to say, look for a new minister sometime in the, near future, it might be the case that we would want to know where he or she gravitated. There is a sense in the professional degree for ministry called the Masters of Divinity, and almost all accredited institutions that we at Woods might care about, boils down to practical theology. That's at least what the MDiv does. Also, it's the case that several people, including Susan, had a DMin, D.Min, a doctorate of ministry, not possessed by a demon, although it can be no mistake that someone was playful when they came up with the abbreviation for that degree. The doctorate of ministry program and the MDiv are both largely based in the work that a minister does. It is largely practical. There are classes in administration. There are quizzes about Robert's Rules of Order. There are things about basic accounting and counseling and public speaking, not just preaching, so that the work that you might imagine a minister to do, one is capable of doing in practical sorts of ways. Because it absolutely is the case that I was in classes about gender theory and esoteric theology that do not come up all that often on a week-to-week basis. That's why I do these musings, so that somehow those classes seem to matter, maybe on occasion. Otherwise, practical theology is the stuff we do week to week. How do you keep a calendar? How do you file your sermons? And those sorts of things, in addition to more preaching classes, more worship leadership classes. What does it mean that we do need to specialize? Not just in ministry, but in general. It is a wonderful privilege as a minister that ministers generally get to be something like Renaissance people. We study broadly in the humanities. We get to read good literature, not just related to the Bible. We get to study ancient civilizations in a way that if you're studying for medicine, you might not get to, or engineering. And so we get to think broadly. However you become a minister, it's the case that at some point or another you are called to ask deep and thoughtful questions. Maybe about the meaning of life and our place in it, why evil and suffering exists. But you're hearing me say that as someone who was primarily a theology student, not so much a practical theology student. Care for the church and how an organization runs would be a very cheap and slight way to say that's what practical theology does. That's also very different than someone who is a Bible major who could tell you all about what Luke was maybe thinking whenever Luke and Acts decided to be a first book and a second book, but they're divided by the Gospel of John, and why that divide happens and why that might matter. I can talk about that for this long. Bible majors can talk about it for weeks on end. And so seeing those differences kind of matter. How does this make a difference for a person who sits in the pew? I really only have 2 points about that. One, if you're particularly interested in one of those so-called 4 fields, which again are Bible, practical theology, esoteric or philosophical theology, and church history, then you can gravitate towards certain people, certain books, and within our staff we can help point you in certain kinds of directions so that you're able to dive more deeply into those particular things. But it is a bit of a loss. Even though the MDiv is a 3-year graduate program, it's very long and we do have to do a little bit in all of those fields. It's not the case that we sit around and study all of the classics. It's not the case that I am particularly well-versed in church history or especially good at some biblical skills, even though I can do that to some extent, and hopefully you've enjoyed some of those things, whether in musings or in classes. Specialization and being a Jack or Jill of all trades. Outside of the church, I wonder how that seems to affect you. Do you sense that there are callings and interests that you might have that somehow, because of your formal schooling or your career or your specific job and employer, it means that you're not able to pull certain parts of the things that you really enjoy or the things you spend a lot of time thinking about on your own into your day-to-day work? I think it was the case once upon a time, and maybe this is nostalgic. I did not live in the 15th century, so I can't really say, but pulling together our Renaissance interests seems to be celebrated for a certain period of time, the Renaissance. And the ways that math, science, literature, philosophy, and what it meant to be human all were folded in together. Each of those disciplines grew, but certain figures were able to have an impact on all of those sorts of things. We think about great people of history. I'm not saying that everyone is a Da Vinci, not everyone was an Isaac Newton, or everyone was even an Albert Schweitzer, a medical doctor, a Nobel Prize winner, an organ engineer, as in the organ that you play. He also played the organ, and he wrote The Quest for the Historical Jesus, all in the 20th century. Fairly Renaissance person. It's not the case that those sorts of folks who are that capable in that many fields come along all that often. But here is the bottom line. Study broadly. Find things that interest you and grow in multiple directions. Unless it's the case, for whatever specific reason, you feel called to answer one specific question and do one thing better than anyone else. Maybe that's the case too. Specialization calls us to focus on those things, but in the ways that it is the case, maybe academically and in general, we're called to be interdisciplinary, or that is highly touted now. We draw from multiple sources and have multiple voices in the room to solve difficult problems. It's good to be a generalist. I think that as we seek a new head pastor at Woods, someone who is capable of lots of things that will be very good, and maybe it's the case we find one thing we find incredibly important, more important than anything else. Perhaps that's preaching, perhaps that's administration, I don't know. But now is a good time to muse about what kind of minister we want. How are the ways that you would like to be led, and what's important to you? Those questions will come up regularly and often in our near future, I think, but it's also important for you to know how you are called to serve the church, what interests you, and what abilities and gifts do you have to pursue those interests. Maybe they're specific, maybe they're general. That's all for you to do some introspection to decide, and know that we as a church have the opportunity to be introspective in those ways too. These are a few of the things that I've been musing about lately. I hope you can muse about them too, and maybe you can email me or talk with me sometime about what those musings are. I know I will continue to muse, and you will hear more of those musings next Monday. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Monday.